We live now?
You're good. Go for it.
Okay. Let's bow our heads here and let's have a short prayer to begin this. Lord, open our hearts to your word and help us understand this complex and disturbing book and how it fits with us as Christians today. Amen. We'll start with some background. This is the period of time between Joshua and 1 Samuel. It's called the period of Judges, but judges were not judges as the Supreme Court is considered. Judges were a ruler. They could also be a judge, and we'll see at least one of these judges actually started out as a judge as we would understand it. They were chieftains mostly, local chieftains that ultimately took their power not by lineage, but by the word of God. And they were local. They tended to be, and as you can see on the one map I sent out, one particular area from one tribe to another tribe. But the way the book was put together, they were interpreted as national activities. So when you say that Gideon judged Israel, Gideon actually judged the local area that he was in rather than actually judging all of Israel. And as I said, except for Deborah, Deborah actually was a judge, and we'll see that when we get to it. There were various types of judges. There were military judges. Gideon was certainly one of those. There were lone warriors. Samson is very clearly a lone warrior. In fact, the only reason you would consider Samson a judge is because he's in the book of Judges. We have religious and prophets as judges. We see that when we get to Samuel. And we have tricksters. Ehud, which we'll get to rather shortly, was certainly a trickster rather than a mighty military man. One of the pieces that runs through this entire book is the cycle. I call it the cycle. People do evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord gives them over to their warlike neighbors. He doesn't bring down hellfire and damnation. He gives them over to their warrior neighbors. The people cry out to the Lord. The Lord raises up a judge who steps in and leads them to victory and reigns for some period of time. Then the people do what's evil again, and we repeat with variations through the entire book, from the first to the 12th judge. A couple of terms we need to use. One is a Nazirite. Most of you know a Nazirite doesn't come from Nazareth. It is a religious figure that's committed to God. Don't cut your hair. Stay away from unclean things. Don't drink strong drink. Clearly, the one who stands out in all of this is Samson, and we'll get to him. Now, another interesting thing is we keep seeing these thousands of people, 400,000, 260,000. The Hebrew word for 1,000 can also be the Hebrew word for unit, which generally stood for 10 people. And so if you apply that meaning of that word to some of these people, where the town of Gibeah sent 26,000 people out, soldiers out, that's a little bit on the high side. And 260 may actually be closer to what actually happened. So we'll see that consistently through this book. It's in 3 parts. It starts with a 2-part introduction, and then it lists and goes through the 12 judges. We have 6 major judges and 6 minor judges. They appear in a sequence from south to north. They also appear in a sequence from the model judge to an inept judge that fits right into the same system. And they alternate. There are 2 major, 1 minor, 2 major, 2 minor, 1 major, 3 minor, and finally a major judge. It ends with a 2-pronged ending, one of which is the collapse of Israel's religious background, and the other is the collapse of the tribal system and civil war. So it goes from stories of Joshua and the end of Joshua, all the way to the collapse of religion and civil comity between the tribes. The themes that run through it, clearly the role of God in history. A desire to live under God as a king individually, and their inability to do it, which is why we get this cycle. They did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He sent a judge. He rescued them, and then they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord again. It's a progressive decline. As the judges go on, the oppression of the neighbors gets worse, more detailed, and the judges get less. They are less of a model and more of a problematic judge. And out of this, you come both a need for a monarchy, and we see that at the very end. In those days, there was no king. You see a need for a monarchy, and also some hesitation to institute a monarchy. And we see that very clearly when Samuel is pretty much telling people, be careful what you ask for, because the king will take your money, he'll enslave you, etc., etc. We're not there yet, but we're going to have examples that show the evils of a kingship, as well as the need for a kingship to pull everybody together. The thing is not chronological. It opens with a couple of stories about Joshua, and then what happens at the end of Joshua. And there's two stories at the very end you would think is the culmination, and it is the theological culmination of the book, but it's not the chronological culmination of the book. If you look at this chart, you will see that all of the stuff at the very end is actually taking place earlier. But it is arrayed this way to keep the progression from the goodness to the apostasy and the problems, which prepares the way for the next set of books. The sum total of the years listed, because it does list them. It says so-and-so, Ammon ran or opposed the Israelis for 8 years, and Orenthal ruled for 40 years. If you add all of those years up in the interim, you come to way more years than there actually were in the period of time, as you can tell that by the generations that it cites within the text. So you can see up front that has been put together without a plan to make it chronologically coherent, because it tells a story, and the story it tells is important to the tribe of Israel as a whole. So we start with the introduction, two-part introduction. One recaps the last of Joshua's years, cites the conquest of Jerusalem, which is later contradicted in the same book, and it's later contradicted when we find that David actually conquered Jerusalem. But it starts with the conquest of Jerusalem. Recaps the story of Caleb. Remember, Caleb was one of the spies that Moses sent out, along with Joshua, the two positive spies who came back and said, yes, land of milk and honey, let's go, we can do it. Whereas the others said, no, they're too strong, we're going to get beaten. Caleb and his nephew, who also becomes his son-in-law, which we found last week, his son-in-law Orenthal, and they conquer. So they conquer Hebron, they conquer some other cities in the hill country, unable to go down low because of the iron chariots of the populace down there. Philistines, as an aside here, were metal workers, and they worked with iron. And so the Israelites during this whole period of time were at a disadvantage because they didn't have the technology to work with iron. We also find that many of the tribes are not successful in their conquests. And in some of the tribes, they intend to coexist with the Canaanites rather than to annihilate them as God had told them. So off the bat, there is some disobedience to the laws that the Lord had passed through Moses. And so the second part of this shows a new generation coming up with a pattern of apostasy, of worshiping the Baals. It constantly says they worship the Baals. They worship in the high places. They erected the poles, and remember the poles were the worship site for Asheroth, the fertility goddess of the Canaanites. And over it says the people did evil in the sight of the Lord. Some of the tribes were actually defeated. Dan, we see that when we get to the very end, as Dan is looking for a new land as a tribe. They did not win their land. At the end of this second part of the introduction, the angel of the Lord comes down and said, the Lord would no longer drive the Canaanites before them, and that Canaanite nations would stay intermingled with them as a test to Israel. It's a key piece because it kind of explains why through all of these we continuously find Canaanite cities near and intermingled with Israelite cities, because here we have the Lord doing that on purpose. We'll find a couple of places where the Lord does explains why he does some things that are specifically to get Israel to do certain things. At the end of this, the people worshiped Baals and were apostates and were attacked. And the Lord raised up judges. And that opens the door for the next section, which actually is a long, detailed story of the judges of Israel. They vary in length. The smallest tale of a judge is one of the minor judges. It's a single verse. And the largest is probably Deborah, although Samson gets a good piece of length of the story also. But we start with Judah, with a southern judge who is actually Caleb's nephew. It says the people did evil in the sight of the Lord and were given up to Aram for 8 years. And the Lord set up a judge, and it was Orenthal. And not with a great deal of detail, either about what Aram was doing to suppress the Israelites, or what Orenthal did, other than defeat the Canaanite king Adoni-Bezek. And he captured Hebron and Jerusalem. And that's kind of, again, because he mentioned that already. And so then he ruled for 40 years. Now, 40 years is considered the ideal length. There are symbolic numbers all through this book. 12 judges is symbolic, just like the 12 tribes of Israel. The description of 40 years of a successful reigning of the judge is ideal. And there's a couple of 80 years. But when you get down to single digits, you can figure that the judge was not a good man. And we'll get to that as we go through this. And of course, Othniel dies, and the people go back to apostasy, worshiping the Baals. And the Moab oppresses them for 8 years. Again, there's not a lot of great detail about he was. We'll see when we get to I think it's Gideon. We have a lot of detail as to what the enemy is doing to Israel. But the rest of these, I said, Moab oppressed them. And we get to Ehud. Ehud's the second judge and the second major judge. Ehud is known as the trickster. First, he's left-handed. This is abnormal. And so the Israelites are paying tribute to King Ehud of the Moabites. Apparently, King Ehud is a very fat man. And Ehud takes the tribute that the Israelites are paying and takes it to the king, pays the tribute, and then he says, "O king, I have a secret message for you from Israel, from the Israelites, and it's for your ears only." So the king, in his upstairs compartment, which can be construed as being his bathroom, by the way, sends his retainers out, and Ehud is allowed in. Now, Ehud had built a long double-edged dagger or short sword that he had strapped to the inside of his right thigh. So he's left-handed. And apparently when they checked him out to make sure he was okay, assuming he was right-handed, they checked the inside of his left leg. And they missed the long short sword on the inside of his right leg. So when he comes in, he says, I need to tell you this quietly. He leans forward. With his left hand, he snatches that dagger and he plunges it into Ehud's belly. And it's very graphic. He plunges it in so deep that the fat of Ehud envelops the hilt of the sword left in him. And it spills out his effulva. And again, it gets rather scatological. Clearly, it's dumping his bowels and what was in his bowels into the floor. And then Ehud escapes through the window. Now, the retainers smell this and figure that the king is making his toilet, and so they hesitate to go in. And when they go in, they find the king is dead. Ehud is gone. He has assembled the army, and Ehud meets them at the fords of the Jordan. We'll see this again several times. He meets them at the fords of the Jordan and kills 10,000. And then Ehud rules for 80 years, double the normal package. So clearly the Lord has looked well on Ehud. So we've seen the first two major judges without a whole lot of detail, except a very interesting description of Ehud's trickery. And we get the first minor judge, Shamgar, and Shamgar's is a verse long. And his major claim to fame is that he kills 600 Philistines with an oxen goad. Oxen goad is a long stick with a metal tip, maybe hooked, maybe straight. Clearly, it's a good weapon. And Shamgar, who's from the north, kills 600 Philistines. That's it. That's all we know. It doesn't say how long he ruled. It doesn't say any more than that, but he killed 600 Philistines. Then we get to one of the more interesting judges, also a major. We've gone to the third major judge. This is Deborah. Deborah's a woman. And Deborah's a real judge. When we're introduced to Deborah, she's sitting under a tree judging the Israelites. In other words, people are bringing their problems with relatives and ownership of land and animals. They're bringing it to her, and she's giving a judicial decision as to who's right and who's wrong. And that's how we meet Deborah. And they come under attack. The Israelites come under attack by a Canaanite king. His name is Jabin. And his general is Sisera or Sisera. We don't often get a dual name like this. We see that when the judges go up against the Moabites or the Amorites, they get the king's name sometimes, and the defeat, we very seldom get a bifurcated enemy with the king and a general, but we do here. We've got the king and we've got the enemy. So Deborah does what any ruler would do. She summons the head of the army, a guy named Barak, and says, go fight them. Barak is hesitant. Now we find this hesitancy coming and going all the way through the stories. Barak's hesitant. He says, I'll go if you'll go with me. Now this is an interesting piece because Deborah's a woman. What general would refuse or decline to go fight unless a woman went with him? But that's what he does. He says, I'll go. She says, this will cost you glory. And he says, I don't care. So she ultimately says, you go up against him and I will decoy the general. And so he does that and he beats the army the first time out. And Sisera, he flees. I'm getting that name wrong. Yeah, Sisera. He flees. While all this is going on, there's a Canaanite. Canaanites were a tribe, and if you remember back in Carl's class, Moses had married a Canaanite woman. Of course, now there are several stories of who Moses married. Sometimes they call her a Cushite, sometimes they call her a Canaanite. But the Canaanites apparently had a rather flexible relationship with the Israelites and with various Canaanite tribes. But Hebron, or Heber, has a camp not far from where the battle is going on. And Sisera flees the battlefield, and he comes to Heber's tent where his wife, Jael, is. Now, Jael does one of two things, and there are two different interpretations of this. Under one, Jael invites him in, sees he's tired, feeds him milk, beds him down, puts him under covers, and then hammers a spike through his head. That's one piece of it. When we get to Deborah's song, which is a lyrical version of the same things that happen in prose in the first part, she doesn't lay him down. She brings him in and she hammers the spike through his head while he's standing. And so the difference is, does she bring him in to mother him, or is she trying to seduce him? In the end, it really doesn't matter, because what counts is the woman Jael has brought this guy in, deceived him, and killed him. And not Barak, but Jael has done it. And so the Jabin then, without his general, is defeated and routed. Now, I said that we have the hymn of Deborah, which is the second piece of the same story, and it's repetitive. She says a lot of the same things, but she has a different approach. She says some things differently. The piece about Jael is certainly one. She cites northern tribes when she's talking about the tribes. And if you look at the map, this one, you'll see that Deborah is actually up around Mount Carmel, up toward the north. And so it's not strange that she would only talk about northern tribes. She talks about God's power against his enemies. Keep peace, because that's ultimately going to be one of the concluding issues here, is God's power. And we'll find several times where God does things on purpose to show that it is God and not the man who's doing the winning of these battles. There's another piece that she mentions that is not in the prose, and that's that while all of this is going on, Sisera's mother is home looking out the window, waiting for her general to come back. It's kind of a poignant scene. And we'll get another mother looking out the window, or another woman looking out the window, when we get to Jezebel much later on in here. The hymn is probably the first thing that was written, and the prose was written later. But Deborah rules for 40 years, so clearly she's a successful judge. Deborah's followed by the fourth major judge, Gideon. Gideon is not his name. It's his nickname, and it means hacker. Gideon's real name is Jerubbaal. And Jerubbaal initially meant Baal contends. And the interpretation of his name was changed after one of the events we're going to talk about here to he who contends with Baal. But the nickname Gideon is what has stuck. The Israelites have done, after Deborah, the Israelites have done evil in the sight of the Lord, with not a lot of specificity about exactly what they're doing, but they've done evil. And the Midianites oppress Israel, or the Israelites, and they do it with a lot of detail. They're marauding through the land, they're burning cities, and we run into Jerubbaal, Gideon, essentially hiding in the winepress. He's thrashing wheat, but not on the thrashing floor where you would normally do it, but in a more concealed area in the winepress. And the Lord comes and says, I am going to raise you up as a judge. He says, not me, I'm the least of men. Look at me. I'm hiding here in the winepress. I mean, I'm not a guy to lead men into battle. And so the angel of the Lord comes and says it again. You are going to be a judge. He says, look, I'll do this, but I have a test for you. Now, I tell you, testing God is never really a good thing. But he says, I'm going to test you. So we're going to take this, we're going to lay a sheep skin with the fur up on the floor. And if tomorrow morning the floor is wet and the sheepskin's dry, I'll believe you. Well, that happens. And so he says, okay, but how do I know that's not a fluke? So this time, if the sheepskin is wet and the floor is dry, I'll believe you. And so he does that. And yes, it is. So he says, all right, I will do something here. And he takes a bull under guidance from the Lord. He takes a bull and he goes to the hill and he tears down the altar to Baal and the pole to Asherah. Remember, that's her worshiping location. At night, where nobody can see him, tears them down. And the populace is infuriated that they have destroyed this altar. But since he's done that, and since he's tested God, he summons the army, mostly the army of the north, some 32,000 from the middle and northern kingdoms, and is going to stand up against the Moabites, the Midianites. But he's still tentative. All through this, we have a very tentative leader. He's not sure he's going to do it. He tests God. He's afraid. He's got the army, but he's afraid to go up against the Midianites. And so the Lord tells him to go scout them out. So he and a friend sneak into the Midianite camp that night, and they listen to them. And the Midianites are scared. They're talking about how powerful the Israelites are and how they're afraid they're going to come up and get beaten. And so he goes back and he says, all right, I will attack. The Lord says, wait a minute. You got too many men. 32,000 men is too many. You will think that you did this and you won't give me the credit, your Lord. And so let's find a way to whittle this down. And the first thing they did is they took the men who were afraid or who were married and they sent them home. And then he took the rest down to the stream and had them drink in the stream. And if some of them lapped the water up as a dog, and that's what the saying says, where they bend over and lick the water with their tongue, he sent them home. He only kept those that scooped the water up with their hands and drank. Now, why would that make a difference? Because someone who scoops water up and drinks can see what's going on and is not likely to be surprised. Someone who bends over and laps water out has no idea what's going on around him. So they nick it down to 300 people. And he devises a scheme. This is reminiscent of Jericho. They take shrouded lamps and they break into three groups and they surround the Midianite camp. And in the middle of the night, they suddenly expose the lights and start screaming and yelling. And the Midianites are scared and flee. They run all the way back across the Jordan. And now Gideon, who has been so tentative, I'm afraid, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that, he mounts everybody up and goes dashing off after the Midianites. When they get to the other side, they approach two towns, Succoth and Peniel, and ask for food, and is turned down by both. Ultimately, they corner the Midianites and they defeat them. And in celebration of this defeat, Gideon says, give me all of your earrings. Apparently soldiers in those days wore earrings. Give me all of your earrings. And he melts them down and he makes a gold ephod, which is a priestly, something that hangs on the priestly garment and is used for oracles, divine oracles. So he collects this and builds what's essentially an idol. And they take it back with them. But on the way back, he's irritated with Peniel and Succoth, and he sacks them, burns them, kills all the people. These are Israelite people. So the first time we have Israelites fighting and killing Israelites. And then he gets back across and he erects this ephod, and the Israelites prostrate themselves before it. And they say, you should be our king. He says, I will not be your king. So we get the first piece about kingship coming out here. I will not be your king. But they have 40 years of peace, but Gideon said he wouldn't be a king, but he's got 70 sons and a concubine with another son. And we'll get to Mr. Abimelech in a minute. But these are signs of a king, even if he's not saying he's a king, having this many sons and concubines. We see that with Solomon. It's a sign of kingship. Well, he dies. And of course, what happens? They begin to worship the Baals again. Now, while all of this is going on, that bastard son, Abimelech, he rouses up the people of Shechem and says, why should we, the Shechemites, be ruled by these 70 people from over here? So we're going to rebel against them. He hires a band and he goes after and he kills 69 of the 70 sons. And one son, Jotham, escapes. In the scene we have of Jotham on the mountain above Shechem, pronouncing a curse on the people of Shechem. And he does it in the way of a fable, where the trees are fighting and the brambles defeat the trees. Well, a guy named Gael takes the people of Shechem and they rebel against Abimelech. And Abimelech is furious. And so he sacks Shechem, burns it to the ground. Then he goes off and attacks a place called Thebez, Thebez. And he sacks them, except the people flee to a tower, the final defensive position. And as they come to lay brambles against the base of the tower and burn them out, a woman from the top drops a millstone on his head and he dies. Another woman taking some strong action here. Now, according to the story, he then says, I can't die at the hand of a woman. Please stab me and kill me. Now, of course, I'm not sure how he knew that that millstone that hit him in the head came from a woman. I mean, that's a great piece of guessing on his part. But he dies. And so we have a very short 7-year period of Abimelech, which is quite literally evil. It's filled with murder and treason. And so our first look at kingship is not a good look under Abimelech. Then we're finding 2 more minor judges. It dies, the cycle repeats, they do evil in the sight of the Lord, just short lines, no detail about what it is exactly that they're doing. And we have a guy named Tola and a guy named Jair. The only thing we know about Jair is he had 30 sons and 30 donkeys. One can imply from that he was very self-oriented, but we don't know. We do know that it was 22 years and 23 years, respectively, that they ruled in some fashion. They're on the map. You can see the timeline on the one complicated list, and you can see the locations where they were deemed judges in the other. And that brings us to our fifth major prophet, Jephthah of Gilead. He's a son of a prostitute. This is not an auspicious beginning. The town of Gilead run him out, and he sets up a brigandage of gang that cruise the countryside, robbing and looting and doing all of those things. So he's off on his own. It says now that the Philistines oppress them. And they oppress them because they've been sinning with non-Canaanite gods. Now, apparently sinning with non-Canaanite gods is a bigger sin than sinning with Canaanite gods. Now, that could be an implication that the Israelis were more closely related to Canaanites that we saw in Joshua, because their gods, although were wrong, they weren't that bad. But now sinning with non-Canaanite gods appears to be a very much worse sin. They're oppressed by the Philistines and Ammon for 18 years. That's a long time. And they finally admit, we have sinned. Now, this is the first time. All the other judges, they said, called on the Lord, please save us. Now we find them confessing that they have sinned, that they have done wrong, and they need to be saved. And the Lord sends the word that I've saved you 7 times. I will deliver you no more. And he does not name a judge. The Ammonites attack Gilead. They ask Jephthah, the Lord asked Jephthah to take charge and defend it. The Gileadites, I do, not the Lord. The Gileadites say that's what we want to have happen. He says, okay, I'll do it if the Lord says it's okay. Remember, he is a brigand, a criminal. He says, I'll do it if the Lord says it's okay. Well, he goes out and talks to the Amorites, and he tries to negotiate with them. He finds that the Amorites are attacking because they're still mad over the fact that when the Israelis came through that area on their way to the promised land, they took land away from the Ammonites. And so we have this line that tracks what I had said last week about, is it not right that you keep the land that your God gave you and that we keep the land that our God gave us? It kind of is an implied equivalence of the fact that there are 2 gods here. One is our God and the other one is your God. But it fails. The Ammonites said, no, we're not doing it. At that point, the Spirit of the Lord comes on him. And now he is ready to go ahead and attack, and he swears a vow. He says, if I win this fight, I will sacrifice, and here's a translation difference. Is it the first person out of my house or the first thing out of my house? Well, he wins, and he comes back, and the first person out of the house is his unnamed daughter. And so he is torn up. He explains to her what he's done. He's cast a vow, and she very nicely says, it is a vow to the Lord. You will do unto me as you have sworn to do. Just give me some time to go off by myself, and I'll come back, and you can do it. So she does. And according to the story, he fulfills his vow. It never says that he sacrifices or kills her. And in fact, there is an unattested, it cites an unattested ceremony whereby women in the future, Israelite women, would go away from their village for some days in memory of this daughter's loyalty. And in the medieval age, there were people who cited her as the model for nuns. But the issue here is his attempt to bribe God with a vow. And that does not do well. So he goes and defends the fort. What I should say is he has irritated the Ephraimites, the tribe of Ephraim, because he did not include them in the fight. Never asked them to contribute troops, and they're mad. I don't know why that is, but they are. And so they have a fight, a full-scale fight between the Ephraimites and Jephthah's army. And he meets them at the ford where they try to sneak across, and it's an interesting linguistic twist. Apparently, the accents were so different that they could not pronounce the word shibboleth. They pronounced it sibboleth. And so by that particular accent difference, they were able to identify the Ephraimites who are trying to infiltrate across, and they slaughtered them. So now we have Israelites killing each other on this downward spiral in the judges. We hit 3 more minor judges. Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. About one verse each, 7 years, 10 years, 8 years, and they repeat the cycle. We have no more information about them at all, other than Ibzan gave his daughters as wives to non-Israelites, clearly a violation of the Deuteronomistic code. Then we get to the 12th judge. Sounds like some sort of a TV show. And it's the last of the major judges, and it is Samson. Samson has built, we've had movies on Samson. There's never been a movie about Ehud, I don't think. But we have movies about Samson and Delilah. We have poetry by John Milton, Samson, Agnostes. And so he's the first judge that was dedicated to God at birth, because we open this with a kind of a type scene where we have an elderly set of parents who are bemoaning the fact that they don't have any children. And the Lord says, I will give you children. Actually, the angel of the Lord says, we'll give you children. The husband doesn't believe him. And they argue several times until finally the angel goes up in a flash, and he does. She has a child, and she dedicates the child Samson to be a Nazirite. Long hair, no alcohol, stay away from unclean things. And so he's raised as a Nazirite. He is the reverse image of the best judge, Othniel. He is the far side of the story. He leads nobody. He never takes an army into fight. He never defeats an army with help of anyone else. He's lone. He's a self-centered man bent on revenge. We don't see any good characteristics in Samson as this thing develops. He finds a Philistinian girl that he wants to marry. No, not part of the Deuteronomistic code. He kills a lion with his bare hands. On his way back, the bees have put a nest inside the lion, and he has honey. He's hungry. He eats honey out of the dead lion. Now, this is an unclean act. So right off the bat, Samson is violating his Nazirite vows. This family sets him up with the woman. They have a big wedding party. Alcohol, another violation. He issues the entire wedding party a riddle and says, if anybody can solve this riddle, I will give them 30 garments. That's a pretty lame bet, by the way. I'll give you 30 robes if you win. The riddle, actually, the answer to the riddle is the lion and the honey, which is he's the only guy who knows about it. So it's a tough riddle. His wife wheedles the answer out of him and tells her in-laws or her family what it is. So they come up and say, aha, we know the answer to your riddle. He gets very mad. He goes off to another town. He kills 30 guys so he can take their garments and pay off his bet of 30 garments. Again, this is not a nice guy. So he pays them off. The Philistines get mad. They come and they burn his ex-wife and her family. Burn them. Samson gets mad. He captures 300 foxes, ties their tails together, puts torches between their tails, and sets them loose in the grain fields of the Philistines, burning them out. As you can imagine, it tends to irritate the Philistines. He flees to Judah. They attack Judah, and they say, we'll withdraw if you give us Samson. And so they capture Samson and bind him with straps. And they give him to the Philistines. Now, you can ask yourself here, they got him, they bound him, and they turned him over to the Philistines, and nothing's happened yet. But when he gets in the hands of the Philistines, he breaks the bonds. He picks up the jawbone of an ass, and he kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of the ass. And he flees again. It says that, and on his way back, he said he's thirsty. And so he pleased to God to give him something to drink, and God cracks a rock and gives him a beverage. This is the first time that Samson has beseeched God for anything, was a drink of water on his way after killing 3,000 Philistines. So it says he ruled for 20 years. During that 20 years, he goes to Gaza to visit a hooker, another really good guy. Goes to a hooker. They try to box him up in the town. He tears the gate down, and for reasons I don't understand, he carries the city gate on his back for 30 miles. It's a piece that I have never understood the implications of. I got why he tears it down. I just don't understand why he'd bother carrying it for 30 miles. But he escapes. And then he falls in love with the woman we've all been waiting for, Delilah. Not sure whether Delilah is a Philistine or not, but given her relationships with the Philistines and her exchange with the Philistines, it is probable that she was, because the Philistines say, we will give you silver if you tell us what the secret of his strength is. So apparently they don't think he's just Charles Atlas, that he's got some supernatural power here. And so she keeps asking him, and he keeps giving her wrong answers until finally he says, it's my hair. She shaves his head. She tells the Philistines they come and get him. And lo and behold, that's right. His strength is in his hair. They blind him. They taunt him. They tease him. They imprison him until they decide to have a major celebration in the temple of their main god. They got all of the big Philistine leaders there and people, and they tie him to the pillars. And now he again asks God, the second time that he's talked to God, he says, give me the strength to destroy mine enemies. And he pulls down the temple around him and kills them all. And so everybody's killed. The Philistines are gone, Samson's gone, and his judgeship is over. Now, you have to ask yourself, if this is the final judge, what kind of an example does Samson set for anyone? And it's not a good example. If you compare him to Othniel, who captured cities and led armies and defeated armies, and you look at Samson and you have to ask yourself, is this what it's all come to? Because that's what the story is telling you. 12 judges down the line, that's what the story is telling you. But it gets worse, because we get to the final chapters. And the chapters circulate around two Levites. Remember, Levites are priests. There's a man named Micah living in the north who steals money, silver from his mother. And then he confesses, and his mother forgives him. And she keeps some of the silver, and she gives him some silver, and he makes an idol out of the silver. And he sets up his own son as a priest. Now you see where this is going all against the religious practices of the Israelites. He established his son as the priest. And then there is a Levite who lived in the south and is headed north, and he stops by, and Micah hires him as his priest. Again, a violation of the religious code. He's hiring the Levite to be a priest to his idol. Now, while all of this is going on, the tribe of Dan, who has been thrown out of their land, defeated, is wandering, looking for a new town. They send spies out. They stumble on Micah and his pet Levite priest and his idol. And the Levite priest gives him a very ambiguous oracle. And so they want to go ahead and attack the town of Lesh. And it's named two different names, and it doesn't matter. The town is a peaceful town. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't have walls. They sack it and burn it. And they occupy it, which also is a violation of the harem code on that. And so they steal Micah's Levite and his idol. And they establish a shrine in what became Dan, separate from the current shrine, which is actually in Shiloh with the Ark of the Covenant. And so now we have a second shrine in the north, and we'll see that again when we get to the split and the 10 tribes of Israel. They have two shrines, one in Dan and one in the south. So we've got a violation of the religious piece here, the religious rules of Israel. We've got a second shrine. We've got an idol. We've got bought priests. And so that's going on. But now we have the social collapse, total social collapse. It's another Levite. He's from the north. His wife leaves him. She heads south and goes to Bethlehem. Now, why did she leave? Is it because adultery? Is it because he was mean to her? Well, it looks like it may be because he was mean to her, because he goes all the way down to Bethlehem and goes to her father and talks nicely to her, which would, maybe he's kind of apologetic. And his father-in-law treats him very well, insists that he stay repetitively for 6 days. Finally, on the 6th day, he gets a late start to head back north. They go by Jerusalem, and it's late, and he decides not to stay in Jerusalem because it's a Jebusite city. And he continues on to Gibeah, which is a Benjaminite city. And he goes into the town square, and he sits there with his concubine, which is also called his second wife, looking for hospitality. Now remember, in this community, this whole area, hospitality was a very special commitment. It was committed in the Deuteronomistic code, giving aid to the sojourner, but he gets nothing until an old Ephraimite man comes out and says, "Come with me, I will put you up." Now, for reasons that don't really come through clearly, the men of Gibeah are angered by this. And this is a very similar story. They come to his door and say, "Send him out, we want to have sex with him." And so the guy says, "I'll send my virgin daughters out instead." Is this echoing Sodom? And so the Levite steps in and says, "No." And he throws his second wife / concubine out the door and locks it. They rape her all night long. In the morning, he opens the door and she's lying outside with her hand on the threshold. And so it doesn't say whether she's dead or unconscious. We don't know. He puts her on a donkey and takes her back north. Now, she may or may not have died during that period of time. But when he cuts her in 12 pieces, we're pretty sure she's dead. So he takes the 12 pieces and he sends the 12 pieces out to the 12 tribes of Israel with a summons to come. Such a thing has never happened in Israel. So come and let us fix this problem. And so all of the tribes, remember, the Benjaminites are a tribe too. I guess they got a piece, and I don't know what they did, because they gather all the armies down in front of Gibeah. And they've got 400,000 according to this. And 26,000 men come out from Gibeah to fight. The Lord says, "I will give them unto you," and they don't, they lose. The Lord says, "I will give them unto you," and they don't, they lose. Finally, on the third time, they kill everybody but 600. They flee. They sit down and say, "We took a vow that we'd never let our daughters marry Benjaminites because of this. So we need to find them wives." So thinking about this, I say, sure, we'll go over to this other town, Jabesh Gilead. We'll conquer it, and we will take wives and give 400 wives to them. And that's what they do. They tear the city down. They kill everybody except for 400 virgins. Okay. And they give those 400 virgins to 400 of the 600. They still don't have enough. So they go to Shiloh. And when the women come out to tend the fields, they capture 200 more and give them to the Benjaminites. So what do we got here? We've got Israelites killing Israelites. We've got Israelites killing other Israelites and stealing their wives. We've got Israelites kidnapping wives in order to keep the 12th tribe alive. Now, I think there probably were more Benjaminites in different towns, but that's okay. So this is showing the decline of the Israelite relationships of the tribe. So we go at the very end here, the falling apart of the religious rules and the civil war between the Israelites. In conclusion, it says, in those days, there were no kings in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. So, been through 12 judges. We've seen everything from good leadership to lone wolf revenge and death. We've seen rape. We've seen intertribal warfare. It's a pretty tough book to tie in and say, what am I going to learn from this book? The early assumption was that this book was written by Samuel, but later scholars have pretty much decided that this is a series of vignettes of local heroes. And you notice how scattered on that map, how scattered out these people are, and how they're always talking about a single tribe. They're very seldom talking about all of Israel. That these were individual stories of local heroes that were knitted together into some sort of a pattern that tells a story that fits into the Deuteronomistic history that actually prepares the way for what we will find in Samuel. They looked at this as something that was written in the late 8th or early 7th centuries, or even the late 7th and early 6th century. Not sure. It could be parts of both, which were ultimately put together to tell this story. I said the number of 12 is symbolic. They're not chronological. They're I would say theological, but they're tied together to get to the moral that they want to present about the collapse of individuals and people doing what was right in their own eyes and not what was right in God's eyes. It's probably really a more accurate picture overall of the occupation of Israel than the Joshuan conquest of it all at one time. It also puts a high value on Judah. Judah is invariably presented in a positive light, starting with the very first judge, which came from Judah, until we get to the northern tribes fighting each other. So it clearly is written probably after the collapse of the northern kingdoms, while Judah is wrestling with its future after Assyria has conquered the northern tribes. There are 19 female characters, to include a very positive picture of Deborah and a very important role of Jael. So there are 19 different women in this chapter. The first 12 chapters seem to pretty well say we need a king. Things are not going real well. The last 12 chapters seem to say, well, maybe we do need a king, but it's ambiguous. Remember, all the time they're saying there was no king in Israel and things are declining, which means there may be a need for a king in Israel, but there's Abimelech. Abimelech felt that he was a king, and Abimelech was an evil man. And so that balances out the whole issue of there was no king in Israel, and then we can look back and we can see Abimelech. It's ambiguous through here as to whether it is pro-monarchy or just showing the decline. But there are signs of hope. Samson's hair grows back. Now, I have to say my comment here, which is totally not in part of the book, but the Philistines know that his power is in his hair, so his head's shaved. They tie him up, they bring him in, they tease him, they tie him to the pillars, and nobody notices that his hair is growing back. I don't know what they were thinking about, but it seems to me that would have been an omen that things are not going to go well. But his hair grows back. There continues to be a faithful house of the Lord around the Ark of the Covenant in Shiloh. And they do bring the tribe of Benjamin back from extinction, no matter how nasty the process is. But all the way through it, there's a tension between God's justice and punishment and God's mercy and compassion. We see that over and over as they do evil in the sight of the Lord, and at some point they atone, they sin, or they pray out to the Lord, and the Lord takes some kind of action to try to alleviate the problem. It is God's enduring love for his sinning people. What does it tell us? You have to ask yourself as a Christian, do we do what's right in our own eyes, or do we follow the way of the Lord? And I think that's a point that you can take out of this book of Judges. Do you have questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Are you able to put this book anywhere in the chronology of Israelite history?
It does. I mean, if you look at this particular map, it actually ties it to from Joshua and Orenthal all the way up to Solomon. I mean, this particular map tries to do that pretty well. Even though if you add up the years, they don't really match the timeline they fit here, and you can see where some of these judges overlap and where they are and what they're doing on the timeline. But it's
So you're saying it occurred before the kings?
Oh yes, definitely before the kings. The whole point of the pro-monarchy portions of this and the inability of the Israelites to rule themselves under God is a preparation for the monarchy.
Okay.
Other questions? No stones. I didn't have Karen here to tell me that she's still recovering from her colonoscopy, so she's not here to tell me, oh, you did that wrong, which she's not averse to doing.
You've never been married a long time.
Yeah, 50 years plus. Nothing else? Next week, we're going to tap into Samuel, 1 Samuel, and I will overlay a little bit of Chronicles on that, because remember, Chronicles is written at a different time, and its timeline overlaps all of the Samuels and the Kings. I mean, they have the same time thing with different stories. So I'll try to match those up during those periods of time. And so we'll see a little bit of Chronicles in each of the next 4 classes.
It's been very enlightening. Thank you very much.
Certainly welcome.
Thanks, Pete.
All right, guys, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Pete.
Hey, Bonnie.
Say hi to Karen.
I will do that.
Okay.
Who is Da Vinci?
Hey, Pete, it's Michael.
Oh, Michael, I should have guessed that.
I don't know why my Zoom picked up the name of my hard drive. I named my hard drive on my computer Da Vinci.
Well, now that explains a lot. I guess I could have asked you guys to paint the map with a name like Da Vinci. That should have been okay.
He's also one of my favorite people in history. So anyway.
A true polymath.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week. Thanks,
Take
Bob,
care.
for doing this.
Yeah. Is that Michael Zimmerman?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
who Da Vinci is.
Oh, okay.
You should add
Hello,
him to
Michael.
the list. I sent him the list.
Hey,
Okay.
Bob, I keep forgetting to ask you to put me on the list with everything I got going on. Pete forwarded the
Oh, okay.
invite.
I can fix that.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Have a
Take
good
care.
evening, gents.